Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's video analysis. Today is the 9th of April 2025, and this is a follow-up on the negotiations between the US and Iran, which is set to start on Saturday in Oman. As you may know, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was in Washington, D.C., and he met with President Trump. And before leaving the United States, he posted a video statement saying that a nuclear deal with Iran would be acceptable only if it included, quote, explosion of all of Iran's nuclear facilities and, quote, the dismantling of all equipment under American supervision and implemented by Americans, quote, ended.
I am now concluding my second visit to the United States in 2 months, a very warm visit from the hands of President Donald Trump. You could have been impressed from the great closeness and great friendship between us. And it is expressed in the topics we discussed. First of all, Iran. We agree that there will be no nuclear weapons. It can be done by agreement. But only if this agreement is a Libyan-style agreement, when you enter. Blowing up the facilities, jamming all the equipment. Under American supervision, under American execution, this is good. The second possibility is that there are just the shortcomings of the conversations, and that's a military option. Everybody understands that.
So President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, will lead the delegation of the Americans for nuclear talks with Iran on Saturday in Oman. And they say that the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, whom Iranian press reports he will be Iran's chief negotiator, insisted the talks would be indirect, with Omani mediators passing messages between the sides. Trump threatened to strike Iran, but he aligns more with the dovish camp that favors a diplomatic solution. Witkoff and Vice President Vance also believe a deal with Iran is possible and preferable. In an interview with Tucker Carlson, this has happened a few weeks ago, Witkoff himself opposed the suicidal Iran warmongering from neocons in the administration. Witkoff said there was, quote, a real possibility of getting a verification program to ensure Iran isn't developing a nuclear weapon, but hawks like National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Secretary of State Marco Rubio are much more supportive of military action and skeptical of chances of a deal. So the intrigue here is one prominent Iran hawk, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was in the Oval Office only yesterday, even when Trump announced that he's engaged in direct talks with Iran. Now, all this talk about direct and indirect talks is, of course, important to note and important to analyze that in this case, Iran prefers indirect talks. I don't know if they're going to shake hands in Oman or not. However, this is based on two factors, one of which is Iran's willingness to sell the narrative to its people that they started negotiating with the Great Satan. This is what they call the United States in Iran. So talking to the Great Satan is not going to be really sellable for the Iranian people unless you prepare the public opinion. You start with indirect talks and then you send signal messages to your people that the negotiations are going well for Iran and Iran is not giving any compromises. I believe this is going to be the media strategy of Iran to tell the people we're not compromising, we're not giving up, we're not giving concessions. But on the other hand, the Americans have given concessions and then the Americans will do the same thing and they will say we have managed to stop the nuclear program if these talks, of course, succeed. But moving from indirect to direct talks, I think they're going to be the ones who move from indirect to direct talks if the conditions were met. However, the Iranians also really do not trust the Americans in this case, and they see the US as a uni-party system under which, for example, the Democratic Party, they signed a deal with Iran in 2015, JCPOA, and then the Trump administration withdrew. But then when the Democrats came again in 2021, 2022, Iranians engaged again in negotiations with the Americans in Vienna, and these talks failed, although they were talking about the same that they're going to talk now on Saturday. So the Iranians have, let's say, not really well experienced, not really good experience with the Americans, and they're being very suspicious and cautious to engage with the Americans directly. I would like to reiterate on the point that the US and Israel share the same end goal in Iran. And this is the capitulation, surrender, and the annihilation, let's say, of Iran's military capabilities, not only the nuclear threat, but rather to pacify Iran from the crisis in the region so that the US and Israel would impose their hegemony and absolute dominance over the region. And they have the backing of many Arab Gulf monarchies. So in this case, I believe that Washington and Tel Aviv share the same goal. However, they differ on the approach. At the current moment, Donald Trump prefers the diplomatic approach, or to be clear, he prefers the coercive diplomacy, sanctions, and crippling the economy and probably starting a color revolution in the country. However, the Israeli side, especially Benjamin Netanyahu, he prefers the military approach. But I think the last call is going to be for the Americans. Americans have the leverage over Israel in this case and not vice versa. I don't really agree with the analysis that Israel is leading the United States. I believe they are one body and one arm in this case. In any ways, Iran, in this case, if it is attacked by Israel or the US or both, Iranian officials say they are going to build a nuke. So this will open a Pandora box in the region. So we're not only talking about a devastating war in the Middle East, which will have enormous economic repercussions on the global economy, especially now on the US, which is living its own financial crisis due to these stock market crashes. Beyond that, this is going to open a Pandora box for something very dangerous, and that is other countries in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, probably UAE and others, they will also seek nuclear programs and probably nuclear weapons. Probably Saudi Arabia buys them from Pakistan. I don't know how this could end up, but I don't think it's a smart and wise idea to attack Iran and wage a war on them and then not face the consequences for it. It is going to be enormous for everyone in the region. So let's hope this would be solved diplomatically and the middle ground would be found. However, in order to find a lasting peace and stability in the region, you cannot only talk with Iran about its nuclear program, you should also talk with Israel about its nuclear warheads. Some estimates say between 80 to 400 nuclear warheads. So what about the Israeli nukes in this case? Aren't they also destabilizing force? And hasn't this nuclear program encouraged other countries to also develop WMDs? One of these countries was Iraq, Syria, Libya. So since Netanyahu is speaking about the Libyan model to solve the Iranian nuclear program, let's take a look what was the Libyan agreement. And this was back in 2003, in which former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi agreed to dismantle his country's nuclear and chemical weapons program in exchange for lifting US and international sanctions. Now, what are the key features of the Libya model? First, complete disarmament. Libya gave up all its weapons of mass destruction WMD programs, including nuclear, chemical, and long-range missile development. Second, international inspections. Libya allowed unrestricted access to International Atomic Energy Agency and other inspectors to verify compliance. 3. Sanctions relief. In return, the US and Europe lifted economic sanctions and normalized relations. 4. No regime change guarantee. Despite cooperation, Gaddafi's government was later overthrown in 2011 with NATO support during the Arab Spring. This would already set the alarm and the red flag for Iran to give up a nuclear program, whereas Israel has nuclear weapons. And judging and based on the events that happened in the past 2 decades and 3 decades in the region, from the invasion of Iraq and killing its leader when they gave up their WMDs back then, after giving their WMDs and destroying them. And the same thing happens with Gaddafi. They shook hands with him. They helped him get rid of these WMDs, and then they killed him in the streets. And finally, Bashar. Bashar also gave up his chemical stockpile in 2013. And what happened to him then? He fled the country after the Americans, the Turks, and the Israelis restarted the regime change war against him. So there is a track record in the region which is discouraging Iran, let's say, to agree to such terms. In any ways, it's important to note here that Israel started this nuclear race in the region, WMD race in the region. And this was back then in the 50s and the 60s under the leadership of Prime Minister back then, David Ben-Gurion, with the assistance of Defense Minister back then, Shimon Peres. Now, Shimon Peres also got the Nobel Peace Prize, I believe, later. Israel maintained a policy of nuclear ambiguity, and this is also known as opacity, neither confirming nor denying its nuclear capabilities. However, it is widely believed that Israel possesses nuclear weapons, with estimates suggesting an arsenal of 80 to 400 warheads. So in the 1950s, Israel began exploring nuclear technology, initially under the guise of peaceful energy research. In 1956, Israel signed a secret agreement with France to build a plutonium-producing reactor in Dimona. This is in the Negev desert. France provided crucial technology, including the reactor and knowledge on reprocessing plutonium. In the 60s, the US became aware of the Dimona facility but accepted Israeli assurances that it was for peaceful purposes. However, by the late 1960s, evidence suggested Israel was developing weapons. During this time, it's also reported or rumored and alleged that JFK was very unhappy with Israel's nuclear program, and then he was assassinated in 63, and this was happening in the 60s, right? So in 67, some reports claim Israel assembled its first crude nuclear devices during the war as a last resort option. In 79, there is an incident called Vela incident. A US satellite detected a flash in the South Atlantic suspected to be a joint Israeli-South African nuclear test. Back then, when South Africa was apartheid system, and Israel had brilliant relationship with South Africa, and they exchanged nuclear knowledge and nuclear training together. In 86, Mordechai Vanunu, a former Dimona technician, leaked details to the British press confirming Israel's nuclear weapons program. So, since the 60s, Israel started building nukes, and this has encouraged other countries in the region, such as Syria, under Hafez al-Assad, to develop this chemical program because they cannot afford a nuclear program and nobody would sell them the technology and give them the knowledge anyways. So they went to the cheaper option in order to deter Israeli invasion. And then in 2013, Bashar accepted to destroy these chemical weapons and he was overthrown 10 years later. The same thing goes with Gaddafi. He also built a deterrence weapons, and when he gave up, they killed him. And the same thing goes for Saddam Hussein. So that's why I reiterate on the point that if this nuclear race must be stopped in the region and should be stopped, and we could do denuclearization of the entire region, then this should go both ways, Israel and Iran. You cannot only focus on Iran and completely neglect all these warheads of Israel, which is willing to use its nukes as a last resort, as they say, or maybe you'd like to go and Google about the Samson option of Israel, and you will see what they are planning to do if their existence came under threat. I've been your host, Kevork Almassian of Syriana Analysis. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you liked this content and you appreciate it, please hit the like button and subscribe to this YouTube channel. 50% of you are not subscribers, and we are around 2,000 or 3,000 subscriptions away from hitting the 100K goal. So thank you very much for watching and see you soon. Peace be upon you, upon your families. Salam.